I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Hello, welcome to Hard Knocks. You listeners are here to listen to our guest, Simon Tam, who is the founder and bassist of the Slants, and who is about to peace out of America. So good on you, sir. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah.
I'm really thrilled to chat with you. And of course, you know, you're extremely famous for this case, well, for your music, for your activism, and for this case that has become a sort of confluence of your music and activism. And I would love to talk to you about a lot of the things that sort of come out of that discussion. So maybe we can just give a really quick backstory of what that case was in your life, and then we can sort of unravel all of the big ideas that come out of it.
Sure. Yeah. So in the mid-2000s, I decided to start a band. I wanted an Asian American band to provide representation for my community, to celebrate, and also kind of give a nod to 80s synth pop music, which I'm a big fan of.
Awesome. Who isn't?
Yeah, so who isn't? So we kicked it off. We decided to call it the Slants, kind of a play on words, taking on the stereotype that people often have about Asians, but trying to inject some new meaning into it. And so we started touring, as one does, did really well. But about a year and a half in, an attorney suggests to me to apply to register our band's name as a trademark. I mean, it's really standard to do in the music industry anyway, so we go ahead and do so. But the government rejects our trademark. They say that our name is actually offensive to Asian people, that we're actually disparaging people of Asian descent. And they cite this old law from the 1930s about it, saying you can't register trademarks that are considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging. And so for them to actually apply the law, they have to find a ton of Asian people who are offended by our name. They didn't find a single person, but they quoted urbandictionary.com. They used pictures of Miley Cyrus, and that kicked off an 8-year legal battle where I was just appealing through court after court, bringing all kinds of evidence saying, hey, we're not offensive to ourselves, losing every step of the way until we say, maybe this law is actually abridging my First Amendment rights. Eventually, that puts us at the Supreme Court, where we did eventually win unanimously. So about a decade of my life down the drain.
Yeah, I that resonates with me a bit.
I'm sure you can relate.
Yeah, so I kind of want to dig into this very interesting law, because I'm sure you were thinking about, well, over this 8-year journey, I'm sure you deep dive into this law. So old law, I think from 1946, is that correct?
Yeah.
So the Lanham Act, and specifically this was Section 2A, if I recall correctly from my research.
Yep.
And I think what's interesting about this law is it's actually, maybe you can tell me, because all laws are really hard to pass. They're, as someone who is constantly going to my local government and trying to pass laws for criminal justice reform, I can tell you that to actually pass a law, it requires banging your head against a wall for years on end.
Yeah.
So do you actually know what this law was originally intended to do, what it was responding to at the time when it was made?
Yeah, so that part of the Lanham Act, it's part of this whole package deal, the Lanham Act, which basically is about intellectual property law. And really at the time it was designed to promote trade, like international trade. But as they were doing this, they didn't want people to inadvertently have things that made fun of the United States, that people would get offended by, that sort of thing. So the intention of the law wasn't actually to protect Asian people or any minority for that regard, because I mean, you got to remember this is passed in the height of the Jim Crow era.
Yeah,
they weren't thinking about those, but what they were thinking was like, oh, we don't want people to make fun of like George Washington or people like that, and so they had these kind of little things of they just left it really broad, and they never really defined what does it mean to be disparaging or to be scandalous. That's kind of a interesting one as well. When you think about like what was considered scandalous back then is pretty tame by today's
Right.
standards. So
Right.
it was pretty open-ended, but that's kind of the context of it.
Yeah. So some kind of like governmental paternalism, basically.
Yeah, they were a little more concerned back then. I mean, speech didn't have as expansive of rights as we have today. Like people were very concerned, like, you would speak ill of someone or maybe you promote communist values. And so they didn't really
Right.
like those kinds of things back then. Not that they love them today, but, it was considered more of a social ill if you did. And so that's kind of why they had these laws. And with Section 2A in particular, it wasn't really enforced until around the 1980s, because that's when people really started to kind of reappropriate terms. So,
Right.
feminist words, words in the Black community, the LGBTQ community specifically was what triggered all these things. When they're like, hey, we don't know how to handle this change in language and this change in symbols. We don't like that sort of thing. So we're just going to try and shut down as much of that as possible. So
Right.
when you think about like who the law was used against, it was mostly against women and people of color, and probably closer to the 90s around gay and lesbian people.
Yeah. So ironic because, considering that it was technically supposed to be in defense of people, and it was actually by allowing certain terms to be taboo, even by those people who were potentially suffering the consequences of those terms, they were in fact reinforcing the negative consequences of by instilling that taboo. Yeah, I think it's interesting that first of all, it led to there being consequences, like you were not allowed to trademark your own band. But then on the other hand, it's not like it was being used to retroactively take away trademarked terms that were disparaging, right? Like I know that there was, the Washington what they were before they were the Commanders. And for years, Native Americans were attempting to use this law to basically take away the trademark rights of the football team, and it didn't work. So on the one hand, it's debilitating minorities from reclaiming and reappropriating terms, but it's not doing that work to undo the negative work done by terms that were just used so commonly and disparagingly that people made whole football teams about them. Like, it's just really interesting. So
I think they were afraid of rocking the boat too much. They wanted to keep like certain norms. And when you think about who tend to be the people in power, those are the norms that they're used to, the way that they use language. So, one of the examples that I oftentimes bring up is like all these terms that women were using to reappropriate, they were getting shut down left and right. Hundreds and hundreds of them were actually being denied, mostly artists, nonprofits, and that sort of thing. But those terms were actually registered by the thousands by porn companies. And so you talk about like what's considered scandalous, what's considered immoral or disparaging. The government had no problems giving those rights to porn companies, but they had a lot of problems giving them to like small feminist bookstores. And so that's what, in their mind, they're like, hey, that's way too scandalous. And so, or even with my band name, right, the Slants, Slant as a trademark was registered over 800 times. I'm actually the only person in all of US history to be denied a trademark for it because they said that I was too Asian to use it, that it was too controversial, that I was like trying to do something with it.
Well, the truth of it is you were, but the law didn't account for how a person could reclaim a slur. And I think that's the interesting thing. Because I know that like in the course of this 8-year journey, there were many attempts that you made to argue your case. One of which was, like you said, other people have the word slant trademarked. Why can't I? And, they're obviously saying, well, because you're obviously making a reference to the disparaging term.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, yes, but that means the law is bogus. And so now you have to go and make an argument to the Supreme Court that the law itself shouldn't be enforced because it's a bogus law.
Yeah, the threshold for that was a lot higher, a lot tougher to do. I mean, what we were
Yeah.
trying to say is like, hey, we're not offensive to ourselves. And we actually, we brought dictionary experts, surveys, all kinds of things. And they're like, that's not good enough because, we found this entry on urbandictionary.com. We cited asianjokes.com, like really offensive stuff. But for them, that was a way of safeguarding themselves from having to change their perspective or to acknowledge that, hey, maybe other people want to kind of inject new meanings into words that we already know and the ways that we use them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because you're like, look, how could I be disparaging to myself? Like, what about the intent of the way I'm using it? And do you feel like the Trademark and Patent Office was just being obstinately obtuse? Or do you think that they actually felt like they were doing something to protect? Like, where do you think that they were coming from? Do you think that they were just being obtuse about this?
I think, it's really hard to read other people's hearts and minds, but if we were to give them the benefit of the doubt where they were truly trying to prevent something awful from happening, I don't think they realized that what they were doing, in fact, was robbing us of the ability, the dignity to choose what's appropriate for ourselves. And so they thought they were doing us a favor, but they weren't. They were stripping away rights from not just me, but a lot of people who are impacted by this and thinking that they were doing the right thing.
So again, that like paternalism, like you don't know what's good for you. I know what's good for you.
Yeah, and even when our community stood up by the thousands, I mean, we had thousands of letters and petitions and scholars and everyone showing up saying, hey, like what the band is doing is not inappropriate. We support this band. It's very obvious. They were so resistant in budging because they thought, well, if we allow it for this band, well, maybe there's another band, maybe there's another thing happening, and we don't want people up in arms about this anymore.
Got it. So they thought that by shutting you down, they would just, be able to keep the taboo sort of consensus going. And,
I think so.
Yeah. And did you, I can't remember, did you actually make we're reappropriating the term and turning it into a non-disparaging term by naming ourselves this? Was that ever part of your argument?
Yeah, so for the first 2 years, that was basically our legal argument that, hey, we're not doing this in a way that's offensive, and we tried to prove it, and that's why we got like dictionary experts, and that's why we got like all these executive directors of these social justice organizations saying like, no, we agree, like we support this band, and we showed how other people in our community were using the term too. But that argument just it was kind of a losing argument because in the entire history of the term or the law, which is about 70 years, no one had ever successfully appealed a rejection under 2A. So, I mean, you got to imagine, like, if a law's been around for almost a century and they're like, hey, if we get it wrong, you can always appeal. What they don't tell you is that you can never win. That's not really like justice. That's not really like a good process or a good law.
Totally. Okay, so you had to take down the law then.
Yeah, we had to have it declared unconstitutional, essentially.
And you did.
Surprisingly, yes. It worked out for us.
Was there any further sort of development or evolution of your argument as you took on the very law itself before the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, because it was never our intention to have the law struck down. Like, we knew it was problematic, but I kind of had this faith that if you brought just enough evidence, that if enough people supported you, that logically the government would say, of course we're wrong on this. You could go ahead and have your rights and you move on with your life. But I didn't realize that the entire setup of the justice system is not to not to be objective about it, but it's to remain steadfast and to defend and uphold whatever position they already have. That's in their best interest. And so your arguments just kind of continue to evolve because you're like, okay, that didn't work. Let's try this argument. Or now we're before this set of judges and they respond to totally different things. So let's try this. Like we tried to show them how the evidence the trademark office was using was really faulty. Like it was outdated, that they didn't actually check with the community who's impacted. They're using wiki joke websites. Like anyone can edit those things, but apparently none of that stuff mattered to the courts until we brought up like, oh, maybe this is a constitutional issue. That's when the federal circuit, like one step below the Supreme Court, they're like, oh, that's interesting to us. We don't care about anything else. We just want to hear, does it violate the First Amendment? And so when we heard that, we're like, we think it does. We tried to make an argument saying that they couldn't use my race against me, that it was a violation of due process. But the government didn't care about that either. They're like, no, they can if they want to do that. But the First Amendment's really interesting. So that's what we ran with. And ultimately, that's what prevailed. And because it appealed from the federal circuit, the Supreme Court could only look at the First Amendment issues.
Interesting. Okay, so ultimately what broke the law was the idea that a office that registers trademarks is an extension of the government, and if it is censoring you, that is the government violating your First Amendment rights. Correct?
Yeah, pretty much. That the trademarks themselves are not government speech; they're private speech. So, the First Amendment prohibits the government from saying like, oh, this kind of speech is good, that stuff is bad, and so therefore, since we don't like it, we're going to shut it down. And so that's obviously unconstitutional. And so we eventually were able to win on that on pretty technical grounds, but yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think at the time I wasn't quite sure. It was just like it was a lot to process. But in hindsight, I'm really glad that we are able to take the law down. And there was another case right after us that dealt with the scandalous and immoral provisions of the law, and that got struck down too. I think in this day and age, probably even more so than when I was going through the court battle, I realized how important it is to not have the government be able to tell you what's appropriate or not appropriate. Because right now we're seeing more and more authoritative type of government that's taking great offense to things being said. They're striking things down. They're banning journalists. They're banning books. And I think that's kind of the road to fascism. So I'm like, I as a proponent of free speech, as a proponent of like, hey, let's talk these things through. Let's be able to articulate arguments. Of course, I believe that we should have the right to speak and make the case for what we believe in.
Right. And also, the government shouldn't be the ones deciding what's considered offensive versus what's not, because we can't trust necessarily the government to be fair about that.
And half the time they're wrong anyway, because, social norms change, they evolve. And it's not just like has to do with like Trump or Republicans. It could be the same thing under Obama or Democrats, Biden. You don't want like rules that are set up in a way where you really cross your fingers hoping the right person is in office. Like that's not a good law. Like to me, justice is when there's fairness involved. And that means everyone being able to agree to the same set of rules, no matter who is in charge. Not, oh, that's the person I like, so therefore let's let them do whatever they want. You don't want to do that, because there will come a time where they're no longer in office and the other side is, and that can make your life really miserable. You want that fairness. I mean, that's the whole point of like democracy and justice. It's like that we have something that's a little bit more fair than, say, authoritative governments that are up to the whims of whoever is there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you broke the law. Good for you. The way that you break the law, you fixed it. You broke the bad law. Awesome. I'm very excited to hear that. Which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So congratulations. And who knew that like something as simple and universal as trademarking your own band could lead to something like that?
It's pretty surprising, but I think the more I study history and the more I'm involved with these different movements, I realize it's not the big sweeping cases or massive victories that move society forward in the ways that we think. It's oftentimes these little tiny actions, tiny cases that kind of pave the road to make it easier for those movements to happen. So, when you think about like the civil rights movement, like 1964 and all the great things that happened, that movement started in the 1800s. Like,
Right.
It started with people saying, we don't think it's right for other human beings to own like people as slaves, and we're going to create this entire underground system and start fighting that and challenging that regime. And even after slavery, people saying like, hey, they deserve to be able to eat at the same lunch counter and drink from the same water fountain and have the same rights and dignity because they're also people. And so it's like, we'll see the big moments, but it's really oftentimes as a culmination of all these other things. And I don't really consider like my case like this big monumental thing. People say it's like this landmark case, but I really see it as a line of many, many other cases of people saying like, we should have the right to choose what's appropriate for ourselves, to speak for ourselves. And I can only hope that we continue on that path where we don't have the government saying, you know what, some types of marching are okay and other types aren't. Like some types of protests are okay and others aren't. We should all be able to express that right.
Can we talk a little bit about reappropriation?
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe let's define the term. What does reappropriation mean?
You want me to define it?
Yes, please. Yes, you're the expert.
I think it's kind of a little bit of a gray area, but generally speaking, it's when people who are impacted by a particular term want to change the meaning of it. So, growing up, for example, the term queer was considered very offensive to people in the gay and lesbian community. But these days, it's oftentimes the preferred label that people label themselves as part of the queer community. They decided, there was this outdated series of stereotypes and feelings that we had associated with that term, and we want to actually inject pride into it and say you can't use that term against us. And so I think that's a very kind of classic example of reappropriation. I mean, there's way more terms that are actually very conventional. Even the term like Christian, it's considered a reappropriated term because it means little Christ. And back in the day, people used to make fun of followers of Christ, saying like, oh, look at those wannabe little Jesus.
Christian.
Yeah. And then they're like, you know what? We do want to be like that guy. So we're going to take that label. On and on throughout time, we have some terms being very successful and other terms not so much. Some are very controversial still, but that's kind of reappropriation.
I mean, the way that you're defining it, it sounds to me like you're you're sort of discussing how the natural evolution of language, and one of the best ways to neutralize offensive terms is to claim them for yourselves and use them in different contexts so that when someone else uses it, it's no longer in this very specific, highly charged context, which again is just the natural evolution of language. So it's almost as if denying reappropriation is like trying to act like language is set in amber or set in stone and doesn't evolve, which is just very silly.
Yeah, I think.
And misguided.
Of course. It's because people in charge want to freeze culture because they are in power. They know the rules, they know the norms, and they don't like it when the rug is pulled out from under them. I mean, one example is just not too long ago, you didn't feel very comfortable with naming the Washington football team's old name. Because you'd say well, I would want to make sure other people are okay with me using this term. Or, there's this general fear people have of having backlash for using certain types of language. And that's a good thing. Because that's saying, you know what, I respect the term, but like it's weighted enough where I want to make sure that someone else feels comfortable with this. Otherwise, there are social consequences for doing this.
Right.
And I think the social consequences is the key. I don't think people should be locked up or put in jail for using certain terms, but I think that there should be some kind of moral accountability that we provide for each other, just as like, what's a common sense, like common decent thing to do to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point, and sort of leads me into the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about, because as someone who has spent so much time thinking about the impact of words and coming out of it as a, in a big way, of many things, of free speech activist, that doesn't mean that it's just anybody can say anything to anyone at any time with zero consequences whatsoever.
Yeah.
And you've talked a lot about things like online bullying and how we should be really mindful about the kinds of language that we use. And when I was researching this conversation, I was really struck by something that you said about online bullying and social media, and how we should think about these places, these digital spaces, and how we engage with them. Because I'm also someone who routinely the algorithms that define what hate speech is on a certain platform doesn't ever really help me, because so much of like the hate speech that is directed my way is not it doesn't really fit into that like algorithm. It doesn't recognize it as like targeted, hateful and hurtful speech, because I'm a singular person, and the way that I am threatened and online is very like personal, and it's not about me being a woman, or it's not about like any of the other like qualities that I have. It's about who I am as a person. And I've thought a lot also about how do I think about these spaces, because I've seen the dark side of them and how they can bring out people's worst tendencies. And it's not just, some loner psychopath in their grandmother's basement, but it's like any one of us who, it might be a nice person to your face, but might be a really mean person online. Like there's something about that space that brings out people's bad qualities. And one of the ways I've tried to talk to people about it is saying it's a tool. Like you should be the user of the tool, not the tool. Like as the user, you are not the tool of the algorithm. Like don't allow yourself to just be caught up in this. But you actually took it a step further in one of your interviews about online bullying, where you said we shouldn't even be thinking about social media as a tool. We should be looking at it as a symbol. And I was wondering if you could, first of all, if you remember saying that, and second of all, if you can just say what you meant by when you said that.
So I don't remember saying that, but it is
okay.
That's okay, because it is something I do think about often, right? I think language itself is also like a symbol, because it's a representation of our intentions, whether it's a thought we're trying to convey or something we're trying to express in some kind of way. But it is only as useful as if somebody else on the receiving end shares the same set of definitions attributed to those words. So like if all of a sudden someone starts speaking a language I don't know, they could be making fun of me and laughing, and I wouldn't really know. Maybe I'm like, oh, they're having a joyous moment. Great, I'm happy for them. Maybe they are trying to say something deep and profound, but I don't understand. I think that that in of itself is magnified by social media, because truly we don't really know a person's intentions, and the same message could be read with viciousness, or it could be read with compassion. And so we have to be very cautious of what we are interpreting based on that. I mean, one would hope that we would just assume the best in one another, but we've all kind of experienced that darkness that you've mentioned. So I think if at the very least, we can see social media as a symbol of like, this is what we're trying to create as a community, but as with many things, its very meaning is dependent on like our relationship to each other. And so if we really want to move past just like this kind of surface level conversation, we need to actually be able to engage with each other, as you kind of mentioned, as individuals, as people. So I think that, tools imply it's actually a use that is designed for a particular purpose. And I think maybe there was a little bit more of that when social was starting. I think nowadays people are starting to realize it is a tool, but it's a tool of a corporation trying to glean as much information from us as possible. It's trying to extract as much emotional response from us as possible, because that's how they sell ads and how they get better quality data. So we have to be very, very cautious of that as well.
Right. I found the quote just so I can read it to you.
Okay.
But to your point, I think you're right? Like, okay, it is a tool, but what is it ultimately a tool for? It's a tool that a corporate, so your engagement with it by giving your attention to it, a corporation is gleaning information from you that is valuable, because they're then going to sell you back products and advertisements. And so it's this exchange loop. Like, sure, it's a tool for you and me to share pictures, but ultimately it is a tool for taking, like, we think it's free, but it's actually taking from us a certain amount, it's a large amount of information due to how our attention is captured by it. So what you said in this interview that I read was, rather than thinking about technology as a tool, we should think of it as a symbol. How does it represent society? And so I think what you were trying to get at in that specific interview that I read was that one of the things that you noted is that in a face-to-face kind of way, we understand that our words and actions represent us. Right? Like,
Yeah.
we are accountable to the words and actions that come out of us, because it's very clearly coming from us. And because there's maybe some kind of disconnect in the online space, or because we don't actually see the other human being across from us or whatever, like, there's this like psychological disconnect where we don't think about the way that we interact with people online as representing us. And I think you were trying to remind people that no, like, our digital online self is also representative of us, and we are accountable to it. So we should think of that in terms of not just as a tool, but as a symbol of ourselves. I don't know if you want to, if you still feel that way.
No, I think that's right, because I think oftentimes, I did this talk a long time ago, that was inspired by someone giving me a prompt saying, like, oh, if you can say something in 500 words and less, what would you want to say? And I thought, oh, that's really interesting, this idea of a word count limit, because I thought our lives actually have a word count limit. I mean, it's a lot more than 500 words for most people, but like, if we were only to have our lives represented by the things we say and by the way we treat other people, what would that say about who we are as people? And I think all of us have the capacity to say some pretty awful things and to do some really terrible things to others. And is that what we want to be remembered by? Like, most people want to see themselves as a good person, but I think part of that judgment of whether we are good is like if we're creating good for other people, if we're sparking joy and compassion, or if we are actually being ruthless and cruel. And so I think that, like, for better or worse, that digital footprint that we leave behind is a symbol. It is a representation of who we are, and maybe in some ways who we are at the core, when we're stripped of that accountability.
Yeah, I'm now wondering how AI now is able to just create a bunch of stuff based upon whatever anybody throws at it. But like, what would happen if AI was asked to take just the entire digital footprint of humanity that we have so far and try to recreate the world based upon what our digital footprint is so far? And what would that world look like? And would it be full of a lot of psychopaths?
I think it'd be terrifying.
Yeah.
I honestly, even if they just created a person based on what I've written and said, I'm like, what would that person be like? Like, and so I think it's probably worthwhile for people to really reflect on it, or at least to think twice before they just write or say something, because there is a real person at the other end of that.
Yeah. So art as activism, that's something that I wanted to talk to you about, because I do think that, uh, one, I love art. Two, I love activism. Combine the two together. But is there something that's more than the sum of those parts when it is art as activism?
I mean, I think art and activism are kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're both forms of expression, and I think they're inherently optimistic in that they imagine a world that can be. Like we assume that there is a more just version of the world we have, and we either create the art that reflects that, or the policies, or hopefully both. But I think they both involve imagination and thinking of like where we could be.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And I think that the best, just in terms of thinking of laws, like how do we change laws? Um, Oftentimes, like on a very practical level, the only way to change a bad law is to invent a new one, right? Like it's I don't know if you've encountered this in your own activism work, but at least especially you see this in criminal justice reform. If you notice that there is a law that is or something is prohibited, sorry, something is allowed, that so it's legal, but it actually is having these very negative consequences, and you're attempting to like make that, whatever that is, illegal, like some kind of police misconduct, whatever it may be. It's really, really difficult to do that unless you provide some sort of alternative like way to like address the issue that previous law was addressing. And it requires a lot of it requires a lot of study, a lot of research, a lot of like optimistic, positive thinking, because it's not enough to just say, this doesn't work, break it. You have to say, here's how we fix it. So I like that.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of like art in a way too. Like it's very hard and maybe almost impossible to create a piece of art that is fully realized, that is not built on its predecessors. Like all music's built on the culmination of all the music we've learned before, and visual art and dance and theater. It like evolves and builds and creates something greater and greater because we have all this knowledge and technique and forms of expression that have been refined over the years. But like you want to create something new, you really kind of evolve it from something else, and maybe you combine your own personal experience with it to create something. In the same way that I think oftentimes in like public policy, it's the same kind of thing, because our system moves very slowly. It's designed that way and intentionally, so it's not thrown at chaos. But
Right.
oftentimes people want that replacement, right? Like we could have said a long time ago that, hey, fossil fuels are really terrible. It's creating all kinds of pollution and things, but people are like, where's that alternative fuel? Like we have to,
Right.
and then we have to build entire infrastructure and systems to accommodate for that as well. So that's why that change, even though it seems very urgent, takes a very long time, because we have to develop in all the components that are touched by it. And I think the same thing happens in law as well, because if you even something to me should be as straightforward as police reform, they're trained to think a very certain way. So in order to change that, you have to say, like, here's something and here's how we can improve upon it to make communities safer. It's very difficult to do. Or even the way we try criminals, it's very difficult to like change that mindset. We say in theory innocent until proven guilty, but then we have all kinds of things that show otherwise.
Right. What are you interested in right now? I mean, this is all stuff that you've been working through in the past. Is this stuff that you still think about, or are you thinking about anything new these days?
Well, it's top of mind a lot, especially that art and activism thing, because, my band retired from touring in 2019, and we started this nonprofit organization that's trying to fund and mentor other folks to think about using their art in a way that also drives like real social world impact. And so these days I'm always thinking like, how do we make the path easier for these artists, and how do we get them to think about like using their art in a way like, don't just write a song about something you're passionate about, but like work with people who are impacted by it, work with organizations, and develop a whole community of like mutual support around it. So those are things I'm oftentimes thinking about, and especially through how I can use this nonprofit to advance some of those ideas, to test them out, and then hopefully challenge other institutions to think about things in that same kind of way.
And at the same time, you're about to, drop house and head to the winds. How is that going to, like, maybe this is like too personal a question, so like tell me to fuck off if I'm going there. But like, this is an interesting choice. Like you've been on tour before. You're basically just going on tour with your life.
I'm basically going on tour. Well, the difference is that in the past when I went on tour, whether it was like music or on my book tour, I had a home to come home to. And it feels different. So my partner and I have decided we're going to sell everything except for maybe a suitcase or two worth of clothes and take our dog on the road, and that's it. But we'd spent a lot of the last couple of years traveling internationally. And I think one thing we realized is that we don't really need a lot of the stuff that we have. Like, I was going through stuff this past weekend. We had this massive estate sale, and I'm like, oh, I can't believe I still have this random object, maybe this memory. And then I realized I hadn't thought about this in like a decade. Why is it still having a hold over me? And could it provide meaning or use to somebody else? If so, I think it's time to let a lot of that stuff go. I was talking with somebody the other day about this book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which speaks of like, you can't carry all this stuff with you. So why do you like hold on to it for dear life? And as I thought about that, I was like, what is it that I actually do value in my life? It's relationships, like the loved ones, friends and family, and it's new experiences. So why don't I put my resources towards those things and not worry about like, the house and material items and things like that. And so it's been a bit of a process. I'm still in the middle of it myself.
Yeah.
But I think one thing I have been learning is that it feels very liberating. It feels really good to just to be done with this stuff. And it's like, what's the worst that can happen? I settle down somewhere and acquire more stuff. Like
fair. There's always more stuff out there to get.
There's always more stuff. Yeah.
I actually am just super curious about this. So if you don't mind indulging me, is there any kind of like spiritual practice behind this? Or is it simply like just traveling around and realizing I'm not missing all this stuff at home? Why do I even have it there?
I want to say it's like tied to like any particular faith or anything, but it's probably spiritual in nature in that we're just trying to think about leading more intentional and more meaningful lives. And so like, it's kind of funny, like in the past, I travel and I think like, how's the house doing? I check the little cameras around, like, someone at the
cat peed on anything. Yeah, that's basically what I'm
someone
thinking.
At the door, is there a package? And now I'm like, I don't have to think about that anymore. And that's kind of nice. And, I think one thing I've been wanting to do, I mean, I don't really have a lot of stuff anyway. I only collect guitars and books. And so I'm like, okay, if I got rid of those things, like, would I be okay? So we had this estate sale this past weekend, and I sold over
Which, by the way, I'm so mad I was not there for, but tell me more.
Yeah, we sold like over 1,000 books, and I still have a couple hundred downstairs, and I'm like I couldn't believe how many books I had, because they're just scattered throughout the house, and when we
of course
put them in the same place, I was like, how are we going to get rid of all these books? but thankfully they were very popular, and so we're good there. But yeah, I did think, like, if it's a book I've read, like, if I'm not going to read it again, I want somebody else to have it. I want someone else to have those stories or that wisdom. And so, like, just as I think about each object in that same kind of way, it allows me to think like, how can I just be less attached to stuff? And then when you have less stuff, you don't need as much money. And then you're like, oh, I can focus my life more on living than on acquiring things. So that's kind of where I am these days.
Cool. So I think this all sounds awesome. The one thing that and I hope this is not like just me being a jerk, but so the one thing that this reminds me of, though, is my husband had some vagabond years where he was just a traveling poet guy. He got 2 master's degrees in poetry and then was like, I can't just keep getting master's degrees in poetry. I can't afford this. So he took off to the winds and spent like 3 or 4 years just going from applying to artist colonies and just living in one artist colony after another. And so he really only had a suitcase and he didn't have a place to, to call his own. And it was both very, very liberating and also really challenging for him. And I think primarily because he said that there was nothing stable in his life. There was no stable relationship. There was no stable location. There was, nothing about his life was stable except for him. And then he would just sort of wake up and appear in Minnesota, At a certain point, he started to feel like he was going crazy. Is there any part of you that's a little scared of something like that?
No, because I know we're going to land somewhere. And like one of the things about like selling like this house and all our stuff is that we have resources to live off of. So when we find a place that we want to take root for some time, we can spend some time there. And thankfully, I have a very understanding spouse who is up for this adventure. So we have each other and we have a very, cute dog. So I think
that'll do it.
So we got that. And, I think most of my adult life has been spent traveling anyway, whether it's with the band or other things. So I'm used to it to a certain degree, but I think, one thing we realized is that long term, we just didn't see this country being a fit for us. We don't have any kids or anything like that. And I do worry that if one of us got really sick, it would just completely wipe us out. So we wanted to go to some place where there's a certain social expectation that you take care of each other. And so that's why we're looking at cultures that really prioritize that. And then the other part is that we've traveled very thoroughly throughout the United States, and we want to have a home base where we could explore other parts of the world and make that distance a lot shorter. So that's why like Taiwan's great, because you can hop anywhere in 2 to 4 hours very easily. And in Spain, you can just take the train. So there's different places where like, oh, that will be really nice for a season of our life. It might not be forever, but hopefully long enough to keep our interest and give us a chance to thoroughly explore and adventure, and we'll be making art along the way. Like we're working on a project together, but the art we're creating isn't for commercial purposes. Like we don't care if it sells. We just want to make it for the sake of making it.
What are you making? Do you mind saying?
It's a secret project, but I am working on a musical though, but with my guitar. So we are working on like a musical theater show because we really love telling stories through songs, and that'll be in the US. So I at least need to come back pretty regular for that.
Okay, cool. Do you know where, are you working with a specific theater on where it's going to debut?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
I think there's a few that we're looking at, but we first want to fully develop the project or get it to a staged reading. It'll most likely debut in Portland, Oregon. That's where our band is from, and there's certain historical nods that we're doing within the piece, but whoever will take us, I guess.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Oh, I'm good, but thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's been a blast, and thanks for thoroughly researching and finding old quotes that I forgot I said.
Yeah, no, I mean, I try not to. One of my big pet peeves with journalists is when they just don't do the basic amount of homework. So I try to do at least a basic amount of homework.
It's very refreshing. Half the time I do these interviews, and like 80% of it is talking about like this thing that like there's a book out there. There's tons of videos already. I'm like, well, okay, I guess
I'll repeat the same stuff over and over again.
But,
What do you wish people would ask you about?
oh my goodness. I think more probably these days, because it is my passion to work on the Slants Foundation, on the nonprofit we started. Maybe more stuff about that. But, I think I thought it was really fascinating. I love being able to like explore ideas that even I'm still in the process of. So like even asking about those questions about art and activism, reappropriation, like it's still a bit of a journey for me. Like I feel like those are ideas that are still evolving. Like how I think about them now are very different than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago.
Right.
So that's always interesting to me because I am a former philosophy, religious studies, like double major. I like love thinking about stuff. Like that's the fun part of life for me.
Are there any artists that you are attempting to bring attention to in your foundation that you're really excited about right now?
Well, so every year we select like a cohort of like 10 artists through a program called Asian Pacifics, and they are Asian American and Pacific Islander artists who are doing civic engagement work with their songs and music. Those collection of artists, they're always doing really amazing things. So we just had a season, it just finished airing on Crossings TV, but we had like everyone from like this pop punk artist named Darrow who like literally survived a brain tumor. It was like removed. He had to relearn how to talk and play guitar and sing. Amazing story. To this artist named Saren O. She's actually trying to fight the loneliness epidemic using music. So folks are just doing like really creative, cool stuff that I wish I thought of. But, I'm grateful I get to be a part of in some kind of way.
Cool. All right. Well, now that people can't, show up to your estate sale, how can people follow you and support your what you're doing?
I mean, they could follow, hop on over to my website, simontam.org, or theslants.com. Is mostly just a giant archive these days, but every once in a while we'll post something on there. So those are probably the two best things. And like regarding social, I'm probably going to be dropping out of that very soon as well. The band's accounts actually we shut down a couple months ago because we're kind of like, we don't need to be here anymore. People have heard enough about us.
Okay, cool. All right, well, thank you so much, Simon. It's great to hang out with you.
Thank you so much. All right, take care.